webinar tonight on the Growling Grass Frog. Thank you very much for attending on a Wednesday evening, and the sun's shining outside, so it's a bit tempting to go out for a walk. Just a little bit of housekeeping. So we're going to use the Q&A function for questions. So if you've got any questions, we will answer those at the end of the session. So if you want to pop them in there, you're most welcome to do so at any time. All cameras and microphones are turned off, and that's just so that the webinar runs more smoothly. And we are recording this session, and the recording will be made available probably about 10 days after the event. So if you want to share this with your friends, you will be able to do that. And I will send through a link to the recording after the event. So just before we get started tonight, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet tonight. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and I also acknowledge any First Nations people here on the call tonight. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Geoff Heard. Dr Geoff Heard is going to present to us tonight on his research into the growling grass frog. Geoff leads a long-term monitoring program for the species across northern Melbourne that began in 2001. Currently, Geoff wears two hats. He is Science Advisor for the National Threatened Species Index at the University of Queensland, and also a Research Fellow with the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University. Welcome, Geoff, and thanks very much for coming along to join us tonight.
Thanks so much, Jane. Shall I kick off?
I think that would be terrific.
Okay.
I'll stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Okay, I'll do that. Just sing out, everyone, if you are having trouble hearing me. So I'm just going to share the presentation. Can you see that okay, Jane? Is that coming through okay?
Looks great. Yeah, looks great to me.
Okay, terrific. I've lost you all on Teams in sharing the presentation. So, Jane, could you jump in at any stage if anything's going awry?
Will do.
Okay, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming along tonight to hear about growling grass frogs, my favourite subject. I'd just like to start by thanking Melbourne Water for the opportunity to present tonight, and I also pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples of our country, our First Nations people. I'm beaming in today from Brisbane, Meanjin on Yagara and Turrbal country. So my plan today or tonight is to give you or to start off with a bit of an overview of this wonderful species, a whistle-stop tour of its ecology, and then talk about some of the threats the species faces and some of the conservation initiatives that are being undertaken for the species around Melbourne. So without further ado, I'll jump in. I like to start these presentations with just a few photos that demonstrate the great beauty of this species. They really are a gorgeous animal. I saw my first one of these probably when I was about 15, 16, and was immediately struck by just how beautiful this species is. This is a photo of Peter Robertson's from an animal down in the southeast of Melbourne. They can be incredibly cute as well. This is a little metamorph from Donnybrook, literally just emerging from the water. You can't quite see it in this image, but there's a little tail stub at the back there. So it's just completed its tadpole phase and is ready to take on life out in the wilds of the terrestrial zone. And just a heart warmer to finish this series on. This is an animal from Donnybrook in northern Melbourne. from the Merry Creek. This is a beautiful male. You can see its throat's got a bit of coloration there. So he's been actively calling, you can see some nuptial pads there as well. So they're what this species uses to grip on, when the males use those to grip onto the female when they're breeding in amplexus. And I'll go into that a bit more in a moment. So yeah, a really beautiful, charismatic species. We're really lucky to have this this gorgeous animal still with us around Melbourne. As I'll go into, it has declined sharply across its range and dropped out from various parts of its range in Victoria and elsewhere. But thankfully, it's persisting around Melbourne in numerous places, and we're hoping to secure that for the long term. So a bit of a background on the beast. So this is a frog that I really did fall in love with in the early 2000s. As Jane mentioned, I started work on this species around 2001. I was invited to work on a project that was seeking to map its distribution in northern Melbourne, in the catchments of the Mary and Darebin and Moonee Ponds Creek. I quickly became very enamored with this species, and I've spent probably, well, it would be pretty much ever since working on this frog. We've been doing long-term monitoring work. I did my PhD on this species, and over that time, we've managed to gather a pretty good knowledge of its ecology and also its conservation needs. So I thought I'd just run through, as I say, a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the ecology of this species. So what are growling grass frogs? Well, they're one of 80 species of frogs in the family Paludryoididae in Australia. That's a bit of a tongue twister. It used to be in the family Hylidae, which was much easier to pronounce. They are a tree frog in the genus Latoria, or now Rhinoidea. So there's been a recent systematic overview and taxonomic change to that genus Latoria. It's been split up into a multitude of genera, and growling grass frogs and other bell frogs land in this new genus Rhinoidea. Despite the fact that they're tree frogs, they generally don't climb trees. The highest I've ever seen one is about 1 metre off the ground, and that's because they're a highly aquatic species. So they spend most of their time actually in water. And this is the way, if you spend a bit of time in their habitat, you'll often see them floating out in aquatic vegetation. This is a couple of frogs in a pool on the Merry Creek in Donnybrook. And they're floating around here on one of their favourite plants, which is water ribbon, Triglocken, or I think now Stachenia is its new genus. My plant taxonomy is also stuck in the sort of mid-2000s. So yeah, a highly aquatic frog, very similar to the ranid frogs, the highly aquatic ranid frogs of the Northern Hemisphere, and that's where they get their name, Raniformis, and this new genus name, Rhinoidea. Okay, so I mentioned this word bell frogs, or this term bell frogs, a moment ago. So growlers are a member of this group, which are collectively known as bell frogs. We don't really know why they're called bell frogs. We think it's probably a corruption of bullfrogs. So those ranid frogs from the Northern Hemisphere are often called bullfrogs. We think that's where this name bell frog comes from, because the call certainly isn't bell-like. So this is the bell frogs. So there's two other species in Eastern Australia. So the green and golden bell frog there in the upper left, and in the upper right, the yellow spotted bell frog, a species that was thought to be extinct until its rediscovery in 2009. And then Western Australia has a pair of species as well. So there's, on the bottom there is Latoria cyclorhyncha, an absolutely stunning frog that also has those spotty thighs, but they're black spots, interestingly enough. And then in the bottom right there is the motorbike frog, Latoria morai. And they've all got this similar call, and it's the motorbike frog is a real drone. It gets its name because it just goes, and that's the sort of call that's common to them all, except they have various additions to the end, and I'll do a proper growler call in a moment. Okay, so growlers, as well as being a really beautiful and spectacular frog, are one of the largest ones that we have in Victoria. I still kind of consider myself a Victorian, despite the fact that I now live in Queensland. And the females can get really big. So there's really strong sexual dimorphism in this species, and the females get much larger than the males and up to 10 centimetres long. And this is what they look like in the hand. So this is a big female from a quarry in Campbellfield that I captured as part of my market capture work during my PhD. So a really big, beefy frog, and they can get up to sort of 80 grams is probably the largest one that I've measured. But I heard recently of one that was well over 100 grams. So quite a big frog. And they're really quite a brutish frog at that size. You can see this female here. She's a little bit beaten up. She's got some scar tissue on the face there, and those huge muscles, those huge jaw muscles there. So quite an extraordinary animal to see at that size. Those ones are rare, but they're still around. And they're a species that has a really large distribution across southeastern Australia. They used to be one of our most common frogs, and they occur in various habitats. So pools along streams, so slow flowing sections of streams, and then a wide variety of wetland types. So this gives you a bit of a sense of their distribution. So all those little purple hashes are records of the species. Southeast and South Australia, right across Victoria, historically, except for the Mallee, the really sandy parts of the Mallee, and also the tops of the Alps. Northeastern Tasmania, and then southern New South Wales, stretching historically up into the Southern Highlands, and along the Murray and Murrumbidgee rivers, right out into the semi-arid areas. And these are the sort of places that you typically find them in. So this is a pool on the Merri Creek in Somerton, as it looked in 2002. This has basically got no flow. There's a tiny bit of flow through this pool, but most of the time it's largely still and heavily vegetated as well. So it's basically a mini swamp with lots of vegetation. Farm dams, as long as they're well vegetated, this species can do really quite well in farm dams, and they're known right across Victoria, particularly in Western Victoria, from these sorts of farm dams, as long as I say, they've got that strong aquatic vegetation. And then interestingly, around Melbourne, one of the key habitats is flooded quarries. So this is a quarry pit in Epping, known as the City of Whittlesea Quarry now. It was a site that was retained for dust suppression in a landfill site. So we've lost a lot of these sites, as I'll show you in a moment, to landfilling. But the frogs do really well in them. They're really, particularly if they're spring fed, which they often do. A lot of these quarries puncture shallow aquifers, and as long as the water is not too saline, they do quite well in them, and they're basically lovely little swamps, fish-free, good vegetation. Okay, so continuing on this tour of growler ecology, another component to mention is their diet. So growlers are a really generalist predator. And like many frogs, they'll basically eat anything that they can fit in their mouth and overpower. We've done some work, which is unpublished, but we've done a bit of work looking at their scats. So during my PhD, I gathered up a whole bunch of scats. I would collect them up each night and put them in a little bag and mark them the next day. And often overnight, they would leave me a little scat behind. So I collected those up and gave them to a really dedicated and knowledgeable entomologist called John Wayner. And John picked through them for me and basically, in an extraordinary effort, identified all of the bits that were in there. So all the bits of exoskeleton of the invertebrates they're in. And they, as I say, a really, really broad diet. They eat a lot of spiders, interestingly. Wolf spiders and water spiders are really common in their habitat, and they eat lots of those. Flies, soldier flies, beetles. They'll even overpower big carabid beetles and amazingly diticid water beetles as well. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with those, but they're these predatory and sort of scavenging water beetles that are really tough things, and they'll overpower them as well. And then things like mud eyes, so they're dragonfly larvae, mayfly larvae, and then the adults of those as well. But of course, as many of you will know, they're also a voracious predator of other frogs. So this is a photo from Claire Keeley from Melbourne Museum, and this was taken during her PhD work around Melbourne. She worked on the genetic population structure, and this was a snap she got down in southeastern Melbourne one night of a growler wolfing down a whistling tree frog. And they're highly cannibalistic as well, so they'll eat their own young. I've seen big females dotted around wetlands as these mass metamorphosis events are occurring, and knocking off the young ones as they emerge from the water. So they certainly don't have any qualms about cannibalism. Okay, and then in terms of their sort of life history, what we now know about them is that they really do live fast, and today die quite young. So during my PhD, I did microcapture work on them. So microcapture is where you visit a wetland again and again and again. You capture as many frogs as you can and you mark them. I actually microchip them for that study. And you build up a sense of their life history and their dispersal rates. So things like growth rates, et cetera, et cetera. And we've now got a pretty good understanding of their life cycle and their life history. So I'll just run through it. So from the adult frog, so they start calling in September and October. So they should be really going strongly in Melbourne now. They really start to ramp up in November and December. And I promised you that call. I'll do it now. So like the motorbike frog, they start off with a and then they put a sort of staccato ending on it. And we think that the bit is the territorial bit, because if you do that vocalization to them, they will respond really vigorously. And then so that's the bit telling all the other guys, look, this is my spot, keep clear, and the remainder of the call is directed at the females. So the males call often in water and in aquatic vegetation, lure the females in, and the females, as I say, can get really big, and that means they can lay a really large clutch. So we don't have a lot of information about clutch size for this species, but they certainly can lay up to 5,000 eggs. Green and golden bell frogs have been recorded with clutches up to 10,000 eggs, so it wouldn't surprise me if growlers those really big females can do that too. So they lay eggs in a mat in aquatic vegetation, so particularly pond weeds. And then those, unlike those frothy egg masses that you'll be familiar with from some of the marsh frogs, these are laid in a gelatinous mat and they sink to the bottom. So I've never actually seen eggs in the wild, despite doing close to 2,000 surveys now for this species. The eggs hatch rapidly within a few days, and then the tadpoles emerge and feed on the aquatic vegetation. So they're scraping up the sort of algae and some of the other sort of detritus that collects on aquatic vegetation, and they grow really rapidly. So growling grass frogs probably emerge from their time from hatching from the egg to emerging and metamorphosing. Most of them probably get through in about 3 months, which is an extraordinary growth rate for the tadpoles. They go from around about 5 millimeters long to up to 11 centimeters long. That's around about the biggest tadpole I've seen. So really extraordinary growth rates. And then they metamorphose in late December, early January, and so that you can get these mass metamorphosis events where hundreds emerge at the same time, or you get individuals that sort of dribble out over the next few months. So you can still see metamorphs through March and into early April. So that's that little one there with the tail stub. So that individual then grows extremely quickly. And I've seen individuals go from metamorph size to basically adult size within 3 months. So they can actually go into their first winter at adult size. And that's for males. Females take a bit longer and probably don't mature until a couple of years of age. So this is a plot of their growth rates. So this is a growth curve. So these are frogs that we've aged. So the bottom there, the numbers are the number of winters that an individual has experienced. And lag refers to lines of arrested growth. And what you can do in frogs in cold climates is take a bone sample from them. So you can take a toe sample and you can cross-section it and stain it and look for these lines, basically like tree rings in the section. And they're denser lines of bone. And when you stain them, they show up. And basically they are winters because they don't grow over winter. So you get this denser denser line of bone, and so you can basically count up the number of lines of arrested growth and the number of winters. And so these growth curves can sort of reiterate the point that I was just making, that the growth rates are really rapid in this species. So males, as I say, can reach maturity by their first year. So many of them will call and attempt to breed in their first spring. Females, we think, probably take a little bit longer, although I have seen females within their first year up to 90 mils in length, in body length. So really extraordinary growth rates for both sexes. But they don't live long these days. So this is that data shown as a histogram, essentially. So every one of those little dots is going into this histogram. And so this is a count of individuals that have survived 1 winter, 2 winter, 3 winter, 4 winters, etc. And you can see this really rapid drop-off. Today, very few get to beyond 2 years of age. Some get to 3 and 4 years of age, but most of them don't make it past that age. But if you compare that to the green dots in the plots on the left there, you can see that there are some individuals up to 6 years of age, and they're museum specimens. So this is from a project we published last year, and we also did this aging for museum specimens that were collected before chytrid fungus invaded Eastern Australia, and they did get quite a bit older then. So this, what we call the sort of truncation of age structure, results from chytrid fungus in particular, which I'll tell you a bit more about in a moment. I'd just like to quickly acknowledge Beck Webb, who I believe is in the audience. So Beck did all of the histology for us on this project. So all of this data stems from a lot of lab work from Beck. So thanks, Beck. Okay, so on to their conservation status. So despite the fact that this species was once extremely abundant and with a really significant range right across southeastern Australia, it is now listed as vulnerable to extinction under the Commonwealth Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. In Victoria, it's considered endangered under the FFG Act. It may have now switched to vulnerable. I need to actually check that in line with the national status. And the reason for that is that the species suffered really extensive declines in the 1980s and 1990s. And we now know that they were driven by the arrival of this pathogen, chytrid fungus, in Australia. So chytrid fungus, for those that aren't familiar with it, it's a fungal pathogen that emerged in the 60s, 70s and 80s globally. We don't fully understand why and where it came from. It's thought to have Asian origins. But it's had devastating effects on amphibians right across the globe. So there's estimates that up to 500 species have been affected by this pathogen, and it's possibly driven 90 species to extinction. It's swept through naive populations really rapidly, and that photo there shows a species in the Sierra Nevada in California. That sort of scene was repeated right across parts of Australia and through the neotropics in South America and also Central America and into North America as well. They were sort of the hotspots of decline due to this pathogen. So chytrid is still a significant risk to the species, but habitat loss as well is an important stressor today, and that's particularly so around Melbourne, as I'll show you in a minute. But what it appears to be is a case of this pathogen still keeping, still being a major stressor for the frog. We haven't seen any signs that this species has learnt to deal with chytrid. Some other species have and are recovering really well from the initial die-offs. But it seems that chytrid still really suppresses survival rates. So that truncation of age structure that I showed you before, that loss of long-lived individuals is due to chytrid fungus. So it eventually catches up with it. And so you've got this stressor that essentially suppresses the populations. And then if you have habitat loss and degradation on top of that, it can mean that you lose populations, and that can happen quite rapidly. So this is a map of Melbourne, and all of those black dots are records of growling grass frogs from 2000 and before. And the pink area there is the metropolitan area as it stood in the sort of mid-2000s. These are the records from 2000 onwards, and so you can see a significant loss of the range around Melbourne, particularly from higher elevation areas. So they contracted, and this is true right across the range of this species, they contracted to lowland areas. So we did manage to retain significant populations after chytrid swept through. They're in this sort of climatic refuge around Melbourne. But those areas, those refuges from chytrid, are now designated urban growth zones. So these are the growth zones that the government has decided upon for the expansion of Melbourne. There's probably some additions to that now, but there is as you know, of course, a significant need to continue to build housing in Melbourne as the city grows. Lots of new suburbs going in to house the growing population of Melbourne. But there's significant overlap with where this species has persisted around Melbourne. And just to give you an insight into how this process can roll out in terms of urbanisation impacting the species and driving loss of habitat. This is just an example of a quarry system that I first encountered in 2001, December 2001. This is just south of Cooper Street in Epping, north of Melbourne. And what you can see there is a series of old bluestone quarries to the sort of north of that image and centre. And then you've got the old Laylaw golf course to the south. And water from the quarries was pumped into the wetlands you can see there in the golf course. And when we first surveyed that area in 2001, December 2001, there was heaps of growlers. They were doing really well in the quarries, in the old quarries, so these were no longer in use. Frogs had moved in and were doing very well indeed. And also within the golf course. So the ponds within the golf course also had lots of frogs. But fast forward to what that area looks like today, and this is what it looks like. So most of those quarries have been filled in today. This image is in fact a little bit old now. The Craigie Bend bypass was put in. The Melbourne wholesale markets went in, and the frogs very quickly dropped out of that landscape, except for one. The last time we visited this area in 2001, 2002, they were still hanging on in a stormwater system on the western side of the Merri Creek, but had otherwise had otherwise gone from that landscape due to the habitat loss, fragmentation and degradation. So given this sort of conundrum of the persistence of really important growling grass frog populations around Melbourne in these urban growth areas, how do we conserve them going forward? For me, it's all about habitat. So as I say, chytrid fungus is still a really important threat for this species, but we now know that if we give them enough habitat and the right type of habitat, they can withstand the impact that chytrid has upon them. So they've got some resilience from essentially lots of high quality habitat. So it's all about protecting key habitat, restoring or enhancing habitat, or creating new habitat for the species. So I'm just going to run through each of those in turn. So one of the key things that one of the key initiatives to conserve the species around Melbourne has been to identify 5 habitat corridors for the species. And these are along major streamlines around Melbourne, in a sort of radius around Melbourne from west to east. So these are corridors along the Lollipop Creek, Werribee Creek and Davis Creek in the southwest, Cororock Creek and its tributaries in the northwest, and also the Jacksons Creek and Emu Creek in the northwest. My old stomping ground in the north, so the Merry Creek, Calcallo and Darebin Creek catchments. And then in the southeast, in some of those really key populations down in the area abutting the former Cooey-Rup Swamp area, so Clyde Creek, Cardinia Creek, Gumscrop Creek and Tumut Creek. And this was a process that the state government went through in around about 2013 through to 2015 of identifying these areas that could be reserved for the frog. So these core areas of habitat that could be reserved along the streamline. And not just the in-stream habitat for the species, but also to capture some of the key off-stream habitats, so some of the key wetlands, farm dams, quarries, etc. And also provide big enough buffers that some new habitat could be created within these areas. So that's the sort of key mechanism for protecting habitat for the species around Melbourne, and I'll go into that a bit more in a moment. So the other thing we can do for this species is restore or enhance habitat. We've now got a really good feel for the sorts of habitat elements that are really key for this species. One of the things that's really important for them is to have big wetlands that are deep. So they don't actually do well in small, shallow wetlands. Bigger wetlands house more frogs, so that's one of the key reasons why bigger wetlands are better. You can just have bigger populations in larger wetlands. But what we found as well is that these wetlands are actually warmer. And that's important because chytrid fungus doesn't do as well in warmer wetlands. It's not as virulent in warmer wetlands. And that's partly due to the fungus. The fungus likes it a bit cooler, but also because the frog's immune system is supported by warmer conditions. So historically they did occur in lots of ephemeral and shallow wetlands, but today you tend to find them in these bigger, deeper wetlands, and that's partly due to the fact that they have this microclimate that buffers them against chytrid. They really need diverse aquatic vegetation, as I mentioned earlier, and so things like emergent vegetation, but also particularly submergent vegetation and floating vegetation. I'll show you some examples in a moment. They no longer do well in wetlands that have any deal of shading. So riparian trees, for example, are a real problem for this species because if they're really dense and overshadow the wetland, the wetland's a lot cooler, and that gives chytrid an upper hand. And so we don't generally see them anymore in wetlands that have lots of shading. They also need really good water clarity. They don't do well in turbid sites, and they need high water quality. So whilst they'll do well in some stormwater wetlands, for example, for a short time, once those stormwater wetlands start to accrue pollutants, they quickly drop out of them. And they do better in sites that are free of exotic fish. They amazingly seem quite resilient to exotic fish if there's enough aquatic vegetation for them. But things like carp and redfin are a real problem. So I'm just looping back to this image of the Merri Creek north of Melbourne. So again, this is this pool in Somerton, and you can see this is classic growling grass frog habitat. Lots of floating vegetation, so triglocan. There, heaps of pondweed. You can see those sort of brown patches in that image. That's Ponamogeton, and really quite open, despite some hawthorn growing on the western bank there. Fast forward to what that site looks like today, and it looks like this, and the frogs are no longer persisting there. So that site was formerly grazed, and that kept a lot of the invasive reeds down. So Phragmites has really taken over there. That is also really shading the wetland. And then this section of the creek has suffered more and more from connection to the stormwater system. And so it gets much more turbid. It gets really high and flashy flows. And that's meant that that beautiful aquatic herb field of floating vegetation and submergence has dropped out. And you can also see some more sort of dominance of the riparian invasives there. So hawthorn on that western bank starting to really take over. And so sadly, this site no longer hosts the species. And as I say, it's because that vegetation has dropped out. They really are hugely reliant on this array of floating and submergent vegetation in particular, and then a smattering of emergent vegetation as well. And they use that at all stages of their life cycle. So farm dams are the same scenario. A site like this cannot support the species, but one like this can. So this is a dam, again, in Donnybrook. And when this photo was taken, there was a really booming population of growlers in it. And so if you can enhance farm dams to look like this through some stock exclusion, some sort of targeted stock exclusion, and some revegetation, then you can really support the species in this sort of setting. But just on stock exclusion, so one of the key things is keeping it open. So we've also found that complete stock removal is a problem for this species because of, as I said before, you can get this enclosing of the wetlands by things like emergence. So they really do need to keep it open. So grazing certainly has its place as a management tool for this species. We're lucky now that we've got some really good habitat design standards for this species that were put together by the state government, in particular Kathy Preece, who was working for the Environment Department at that stage and is now leading the Growling Grass Frog program with Melbourne Water. So there's lots of opportunities to enhance habitat for this species. The other thing we can do, of course, is create new habitat. And one of the great things about growlers from a conservation perspective is that they respond really enthusiastically to new habitat created within their dispersal distance. And that's the plan within these corridors over the next few decades, is to create a series of wetlands, up to 80, for this species to support them. So these will be dedicated wetlands that there will be key breeding sites. That's the aim. And hopefully we can support them through creating networks of those sites. So this is a bit of a schematic from one of the supporting documents for the Growling Grass Frog program. And this is the aim essentially. So we've got habitat still in stream, hopefully, but these new wetlands being put in, and that will give them an array of sites that they can breed in and disperse between and support these what we call meta-population dynamics. So it's really key to the persistence of this species that they can move around between different wetlands through time and take advantage of habitat conditions as they change. So this is one of the sites that's been created. So this is out in Rockbank, one of the first ones that's gone in, and it's got all those sort of key habitat features that we've identified. So it's got lots of rock. I haven't really talked about rock to this point, but rock is a good way of giving them opportunities to bask and shake the fungus. So they'll sit on those rocks that warm up really well in the sun and that gives them an opportunity to shake their infections. And then we've got those aquatic vegetation components going in as well. And I've seen some more recent photos of this site, and it's looking really good. The submergents in particular are really taking off. So there is an opportunity to create wetlands like this, and with a bit of management, the frogs can hang in at these sites for a long time. So I'm just going to finish quickly by some slides with some information about how you can help this species. So if you own habitat, you might be based on the outskirts of Victoria or in regional Victoria and have habitat for this species on your property. So you can enhance or restore that habitat following DECA's design standards. So that's doing things like increasing wetland size and depth, removing shading vegetation, particularly exotics and invasives. You could pursue aquatic revegetation at these sites and potentially look at removing exotic fish if you have them in your farm dams or the wetlands on your property. Things like carp and redfin, as I say, are particularly important to get rid of. And then those rock beds can be quite advantageous as well. You can, of course, create more habitat. So building new farm dams, digging new farm dams for this species, they will readily colonise them. And as long as they've got the right characteristics, they can be really good habitat in the long term. If you live near habitat, so if you live near one of these corridors, I really encourage you to get involved in restoration activities along the creek lines. And even just a weekend spent removing willows and hawthorn, elms, etc., can make a huge difference to growling grass frog habitat. Removing that shading can really give them an advantage against chytrid fungus. And I'd encourage you to be a real guardian for your habitat and spread the word. There are lots of levers we can pull to conserve this species, and with just a little bit of help, I really do strongly believe that we can keep strong populations around Melbourne. The other thing you can do, of course, is help us track how their populations are going. So we've done long-term monitoring in the north of Melbourne, but a really key information source as well is from citizen scientists. So Melbourne Water, of course, has its annual frog census, and that's some really key information for us for keeping track of where the species is hanging on. Are these known populations persisting? And are they colonising and doing well in new habitat that's being created? So I'd really encourage you to get involved in the frog census. And then finally, Jane asked me to tell you a little bit about what you could do in terms of supporting frogs more broadly with frog ponds in your garden. Growlers are quite tricky to conserve right in an urban context. They really do need that space. But there's a host of other frogs that you can support within an urban context, within urban backyards in Melbourne. So things like Ewing's tree frogs or brown tree frogs, spotted marsh frogs, common froglets, pobblebonks or banjo frogs, and striped marsh frogs. They'll often colonise ponds when you put them in and can do really well in those sort of settings. There's lots of resources now online for templates for building frog ponds. But there are many of the things that I've shown you for growling grass frogs, but just on a smaller scale. So you might have lots of rocks for shelter, really good aquatic vegetation, a shallow water zone and a deep water zone, a little bit of shading, but not too much. So the elements that growlers do well in at a large scale, these other frogs will do well in at a smaller scale. So just a couple of examples of the sorts of things that you could potentially put in your garden. They can be quite aesthetic as well. They really do well with these sorts of combinations of nice terrestrial shelter and lots of aquatic vegetation, and not too much sun, but also a bit of sun to ensure that they get enough warmth to, particularly in spring, to get going with their breeding. So I'll finish up there, and hopefully we've still got a bit of time for questions. I'll stop sharing my screen, and hopefully that means I can see you all again. Yes, it does. So yeah, thanks again for coming along, and be really happy to answer any questions.
Geoff. That was really interesting, and even got a few gardening tips in there at the end, which is it's wonderful. Hopefully we might have a few questions from the audience. So now is the time. If you've got any burning issues that you'd like solved, while we've got Geoff's time, if you pop your questions into the chat, we can present them to Geoff.
Jane, there's a couple in the Q&A from John.
Okay. Let's have a look. So John asks, regarding salinity, there was a thought a decade or two ago that maybe growling grass frogs can tolerate a slightly higher salinity level than chytrid can, and saline groundwater fed wetlands or creeks with high natural salinity might be refugia. Studied and not considered relevant. See less. Sorry, do without see less. Would you like to comment on that, Geoff?
Yeah, that's a really key point, John. And so those quarries that I mentioned that are often groundwater fed are a bit saline, and the frogs do well in them because of that. So as long as it isn't too saline, and by too saline I mean up to about so an EC of about 15,000 is about as high as I've ever seen the species in. So those quarries are often sitting about 4,000 to 5,000 EC, and the frogs will do quite well in those. And that is, we believe, because chytrid doesn't do so well in those conditions. And indeed, we see a considerably lower prevalence of chytrid infections in those systems. It's a tricky thing to manage, of course, because those wetlands can quickly dip into the zone of being too saline, and there were some populations that were lost in the Plenty Gorge quarries that some of you will be familiar with when they did get too saline. So during the Millennium Drought, they got really saline and the frogs dropped out of them. So it's a bit of a tightrope in terms of management. Melbourne Water, in terms of those new wetlands that they're creating, are actually setting up a shandying system. So they're fed by groundwater, but also by fresh water obtained from various sources. And the idea is that you can keep the wetlands in that sweet spot where it gives the frogs a bit of a leg up against chytrid fungus, but doesn't get too saline that it kills off the taddies. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
So John has also got another question about protecting frogs from major roads that might be near their habitat. And he's wondering about the effectiveness of frog fences and underpasses and whether these reduce the roadkill of growling grass frogs and allow them to disperse in the landscape.
Yeah, so that's been one of the key things that have been done around Melbourne as well, is try to implement these underpasses under the really big roads. So Craigieburn Bypass that I showed you in that image from Epping. But we don't have any evidence that they're currently effective, and they're often they've been done in a fairly poor way historically. The original culverts, those ones under the Craigieburn Bypass, for example, were just a giant pipe, and there was basically no chance that a frog was ever going to go down them, and if it did, it would die halfway through because they're dry in the centre. So there's been efforts to improve them and make sure they've got continuous wet area underneath them, and I'm sure that will help. In terms of the frog fences, they certainly have the potential to work, and there's a lot of efforts overseas with frog fences to guide frogs to these culverts and allow migration. But what we've seen around Melbourne is that they're just not maintained. So you'll quickly see within a few years that they're flapping in the breeze, essentially, and they've got gaping holes underneath them and through them. So yeah, so the short answer is no. There's no evidence that they're proved effective. But there's been, I suppose, learnings about that, and hopefully going forward, better efforts will be made with those sorts of structures.
Thanks. So Jess said, thank you, Geoff. was a great talk, and she is curious to know about how landholders should balance the habitat preferences for growling grass frog with other species such as the platypus and pygmy perch that do prefer overhanging vegetation.
Yeah, that's a great point. So pygmy perch will often be found in with growlers, particularly in Western Victoria, where there's still good pygmy perch populations. And part of that is because they really like the same sort of vegetation type. So those submergent vegetation, things like Pronomegaton and then water ribbon. So there's a reasonable synergy there in terms of the habitat requirements of pygmy perch and growlers. But yeah, those other species where it's true for pygmy perch as well, in that they can do well in those with lots of emergent vegetation as well. So in those sort of cases, what I've thought best in the past is to have a mosaic. So you might fence off a section that keeps the stock out and lets the emergence grow up in a short section, but then another section where you keep it open and keep the stock going in there. As long as it's deep enough, the aquatic veg will do okay. And so we've seen that in northern Melbourne in some of the areas where revegetation has been done, that this sort of mosaic has been implemented with some sections fenced and other sections not. And so you can maintain that diversity. So I think there's plenty of scope to support species that do like some overhanging vegetation, and then growlers that need it really open.
Thank you. And another question from Patrizio is asking, in regards to shading with revegetation, if decline in numbers is faster than the ability for vegetation to regrow, will you consider placing temporary protection measures in this case to protect the population, for example, shelters?
Yeah, so that's another thing that's been trialled in Gippsland, is to have these sort of small fenced off areas. So in some of these big morass type environments, you can sort of fence off smaller sections of the wetland, and those can be sites where you can really densely vegetate them, and hopefully those become sort of mini refugia within the wetland. And then, those sort of rocky structures as well can be really good for that too. I showed you that sort of rock benching that's been put in place around the Melbourne Water sites, but you can extend that out into the wetland as well, and that can give protection to aquatic vegetation too. So that's another way that you could manage grazing, for example. You could have these rock piles that extend into the water that will keep the cattle out, but the vegetation can do well in those sorts of situations. So yeah, there's lots of options for that. And then terrestrial shelters can be really important as well. And they'll use a really wide range of terrestrial shelters. So even, big boards, bits of timber, roofing tiles, dare I say it, bits of concrete. I've seen them under pretty much anything, mattresses, anything that has big, nice surface area and keeps it fairly moist underneath, they'll use. So there's plenty of options there, and you can think out of the box. It doesn't have to be natural. You can use those artificial structures too.
So in some ways, they're quite an adaptable species in terms of they don't necessarily need a pristine habitat. The idea that they have inhabited some of these quarries and dams and things seems to indicate that in some ways they are quite robust. Yeah,
it's really interesting now that they're basically being changed by chytrid fungus. They once a super robust frog and could live just about anywhere. They're still a pretty robust frog, but less so now because of chytrid. And so as long as we've got these key elements that they require, and particularly key elements for breeding, they can sort of outbreed the fungus. They can outbreed the mortality from the fungus. So it's really about supporting those key habitat elements that lead to that increase survival of adults, but also get lots of recruitment through. So that's why that vegetation is so important, because it protects the eggs and tadpoles in particular from predators, not just fish, but crustaceans and invertebrates as well. So as long as we get those things right, the frogs can actually do really quite well.
So we've got one more question just popped up from Son. You mentioned that the growling grass frog tend to disperse once pollutant and toxicants begin to accumulate. What are some of the strategies being used to manage water quality long term to ensure the habitat remains suitable for these species, specifically within highly urbanised areas?
Yeah, so that's what we've seen repeatedly over the years is the frogs will very rapidly move into these new stormwater wetlands, and they'll often go gangbusters in them. I've seen hundreds of metamorphs coming out of stormwater wetlands. But yes, as they accrue these pollutants, and they also accrue nutrients. So, and that's a problem because the emergent vegetation takes over. So, and that means the submergent vegetation, the floating vegetation drops out. So one of the things that can be done is firstly better managing the stormwater. So rather than it just emptying straight into the stormwater wetland, you can have some pre-treatment wetlands, and that is being trialled in some areas to filter out some of those really gross pollutants. And then another option is sort of staged resetting, they call it, where you basically drain a wetland and then scoop out a lot of the sediments that have accumulated all of those nutrients and toxins and get rid of those. And so that was done some years ago at some big stormwater wetlands along the Moonee Ponds Creek. And as long as that's done in a staged way, so the frogs have got somewhere to go, so they've got a site that remains full, they can hug it down in that, and then they'll recolonise this new wetland once it's this wetland once it's refilled. So there are levers to pull there in terms of managing that, but it is expensive and difficult. So that'll be one of the key challenges going forward is ensuring that happens at a frequency that can keep the frogs happy, essentially.
Because there are regimes for cleaning out those stormwater wetlands anyway, because they do accumulate a lot of sediment and a lot of vegetation and don't become quite as effective as they are when they're first installed. Yeah. So we've got another question from Alex, who is asking your thoughts on frog saunas. I think frog saunas have been getting a lot of media lately. Any thoughts on that?
And rightly so, yeah. So, so there's two options: frog saunas and frog spas. So the spas are basically little saline ponds, so within that zone that the frogs can tolerate, but Chytra doesn't do well at. And there's some trialling of that for green and golden bell frogs around the place. And there's currently a reintroduction program in Canberra for that species that will be using those frog spas. So we'd love to see those rolled out around Melbourne as well. I think they've got a lot of potential. And then the saunas, so for those that aren't familiar, these are basically little greenhouse structures that you can put in growler habitat and for green and golden bell frogs as well. And the idea is that they can sit in them so they're a little greenhouse, usually at the water's edge, and you've got a stack of bricks in there as well, which are often painted black or they're black clay to begin with. And so the frogs can sit in there and they've got access to come and go, and they can use those to warm themselves up, raise their body temperature, and kill the fungus. So the fungus can't survive above 30 degrees, but the frogs can happily sit above that temperature for short time periods. So yeah, they've got lots of potential. We'd love to see those trialled around Melbourne as well. They have been proven to be quite successful for green and golden bell frogs. And it's something I would love to trial myself. I think it's got a lot of potential to help the species out. Yeah.
Lovely, and the questions keep on coming in. So we've got two more that we'll follow up with, and then I think we better wrap up. So Felix asks about how do we find out where there are populations. We live in the Golden Plains Shire between Geelong and Ballarat and are creating a frog habitat. It would be great to attract the growling grass frog.
Yeah, so one of the easiest things to do is to jump onto the Atlas of Living Australia and have a look at there. If you just search for Growling Grass Frog, Latoria raniformis, you'll find records of the species right across its range. They're still hanging on out your way, so it wouldn't surprise me at all if they're nearby. But also speak to the local DECA office, so Department of I'm gonna mangle this now. Department of Environment, Energy, and Climate Action. So have a chat to them and all your local NRM body as well. They've probably got some information on where remnant populations are hanging on. So yeah, those sorts of resources can hopefully point you in the right direction.
And the last question we'll answer tonight is from Chris, who asks, how do you see community-driven tools like Melbourne Water's Frog Census app contributing to our understanding of urban frog populations? What sorts of observations would be especially valuable for people to submit?
Yeah, I think there's a really important role for citizen science with this species and others. So our long-term monitoring program costs a lot. It's pretty labour intensive. We can only do it every 5 years, given those restrictions. So that gives us, this sort of staged insight into what's happening for the species around urban Melbourne. So things like Melbourne Water's Frog Census are great. Frog ID as well from the Australian Museum, another initiative, can really give us greater insight into where the frogs are. And just to give you a sort of tangible example, there's a little population which I hope is still hanging in there at Edgar's Lake, north of Melbourne in Coburg, and that came to us via citizen scientists. So that was a site that I would never have visited because I thought it was well south of where the species was persisting. But yeah, citizen scientists got a recording for us, and we became aware of that population. So yeah, cast the net wide, and yeah, get recordings at as many sites as possible, not just for this species but others. And one of the things you can do to maximise your success is focusing on this period. So in the early spring to early summer period is when there's quite a bit of overlap between our winter, spring and summer breeding frogs. So yeah, so those recordings at this time of year can be really quite valuable.
Yes, we've had a few reports come in from unusual locations where you wouldn't necessarily expect to find growling grass frogs. So citizen scientists definitely have a role to play, I think. So I think we'll wrap up there. There's a couple of questions in the chat that we will follow up after to the webinar. But I just wanted to let you know that we do have a frog census event coming up. So if you would like to learn more about how to use the frog census and how to get out there and capture records of frogs, you can join that event on Saturday, November the 29th, which will be at the Kalkallo wetlands. And you can find information about that on Melbourne Water's social media pages. And I will provide you with my contact information as well if you want to get in touch to ask any questions. But there's just one little thing I'd like to ask of you. If you could complete some feedback for us, that would be really useful. It helps guide the kind of events that we put on. We need to know whether we're hitting the mark with our events. So if I'll just share my screen, and I've got a QR code that you can just scan with your phone. It's a very short survey. It won't take you 5 minutes to do. And that really helps us, as I say, with putting on events like this one. So I'll leave it on the screen for a minute or so to enable you to capture that. So the recording of this webinar will be available in about 2 weeks, and I will send out a link to where you can find that recording so that you can share that with your friends as well. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming along tonight. It's great to have such a good turnout. And the last screen I'll show you is just some contact details for me. So I'm the Water Watch coordinator for the Frog Census program. So if you've got any questions about the frog census, I'm more than happy to help you out with that. And thanks again, Geoff, for that wonderful presentation. It was really interesting. I learnt a whole lot of new things. Really enjoyable. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks everyone for coming along.
Good night.